They didn't just survive the mountains, they ruled them. And no one who crossed their bloodline lived to tell the story.
Deep in the mist-shrouded hollers of Appalachia, where civilization ends and something darker begins, certain family names were spoken only in hushed whispers. These weren't your typical mountain folks struggling to make ends meet. These were bloodlines that carved out their own savage kingdoms in America's forgotten valleys, where federal law was just a distant rumor and survival meant being more ruthless than your neighbors. For over 2 centuries, these clans operated beyond the reach of justice, creating their own twisted codes of honor that left trails of bodies from Virginia to Alabama. What you're about to discover isn't found in any history textbook because these stories were deliberately buried along with most of their victims. Today, we're venturing into territories where even seasoned law enforcement feared to tread, uncovering the blood-soaked legacies of 11 family dynasties that turned isolated mountain communities into their personal hunting grounds. So before you take comfortable, take a minute to like and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time it is for you. These weren't just criminals, they were architects of terror who understood that in the remote Appalachian wilderness, fear was the ultimate currency. Each family we'll explore today controlled their territory through a carefully orchestrated blend of psychological warfare, strategic violence, and an almost supernatural ability to vanish into the mountains whenever outside authorities came calling. What made them truly terrifying wasn't just their capacity for brutality, but their generational commitment to it. This was evil passed down like a family recipe, refined and perfected over decades. By the time we're finished, you'll understand why entire communities packed up and fled rather than face these mountain dynasties, and why some remote valleys remained completely uninhabited for generations after these families finally met their end. So settle in, because we're about to explore a side of American history that will challenge everything you thought you knew about law and order in this country. Run the Morrison clan of Devil's Backbone Ridge. In the treacherous terrain of eastern Kentucky, where narrow mountain passes created natural fortresses, the Morrison family established what amounted to their own sovereign territory in the 1860s, led by the imposing figure of Jeremiah Morrison, a Civil War deserter who stood nearly 7 feet tall. This clan understood that controlling the mountain passes meant controlling everything that moved through their domain. What made the Morrisons particularly dangerous was their systematic approach to terror. Unlike other mountain families who acted on impulse, the Morrisons operated like a military unit. Jeremiah had divided his territory into sectors, each patrolled by different family members who reported back on every stranger, every unusual activity, every potential threat. They maintained detailed intelligence on neighboring communities, knowing which families had money, which had enemies, and which had secrets worth exploiting. Their specialty was what locals called shadow taxation. Travelers passing through Morrison territory would find their path blocked by fallen trees or rock slides that appeared overnight. When they stopped to clear the obstacles, Morrison family members would emerge from the forest, demanding payment for safe passage. Those who paid were allowed through unharmed. Those who refused simply vanished, their belongings distributed among family members as both prophet and warning. The most chilling aspect of Morrison operations was their record keeping. When authorities finally raided their main compound in 1893, they discovered ledgers documenting hundreds of transactions spanning 3 decades. Each entry included the victim's name, their estimated wealth, the amount extracted, and disturbingly, a notation system indicating whether the person had been allowed to live or had been eliminated. The final column in each ledger contained a single word: disposed, relocated, or returned. What disposed meant became clear when investigators found a series of unmarked graves scattered throughout Morrison territory. Relocated referred to victims who had been sold to other criminal organizations or forced into indentured labor in remote mining operations. Returned was reserved for those rare individuals who had somehow earned the family's respect and were allowed to leave unharmed, though always with the understanding that speaking about their experience would result in immediate execution. The Morrison Reign of Terror finally ended during a 3-day siege in November 1893, when a combined force of federal marshals and Kentucky State Militia surrounded their mountain stronghold. Even then, the family's knowledge of the terrain allowed most members to escape through a network of caves and hidden trails they'd spent decades developing. Jeremiah Morrison himself was never captured, though his distinctive size and a pronounced limp from an old war wound made him easily recognizable. Sightings continued for years afterward, always in different states, always just ahead of pursuing lawmen. Local legend claims that Jeremiah lived until 1920, continuing to operate a smaller criminal network while avoiding capture through an elaborate system of safe houses and loyal contacts throughout the mountain regions. Whether true or not, the Morrison name remained synonymous with terror in eastern Kentucky well into the 20th century, with parents using stories of the family to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. 2. The Blackwood Syndicate of Blood Mountain. Georgia's Blood Mountain earned its ominous name long before the Blackwood family claimed it as their headquarters in 1875. But under their control, the peak lived up to its reputation in ways that defied imagination. Unlike other mountain families who relied primarily on physical intimidation, the Blackwoods understood the power of psychological warfare and used it to maintain control over a territory spanning 3 counties. The family was led by twin brothers, Silas and Cyrus Blackwood, whose identical appearance became a crucial element in their reign of terror. The brothers would deliberately appear in multiple locations simultaneously, creating the illusion that they possessed supernatural abilities or could be in several places at once. This simple trick evolved into an elaborate mythology that the Blackwoods carefully cultivated, allowing superstition to do much of their work for them. Their criminal operations focused on what they called blood debts, a twisted system of justice that they imposed on surrounding communities. When someone in their territory was accused of wrongdoing, the Blackwoods would investigate and render judgment. Their verdicts always involved payment in one of 3 forms: money, service, or blood. Those who could afford monetary payment were allowed to resolve their debt immediately. Those who couldn't were forced into indentured servitude, working Blackwood mining operations or timber harvests until their debt was considered satisfied. The third option, blood payment, was reserved for crimes the Blackwoods deemed particularly serious, or for individuals who had somehow offended the family directly. These sentences were carried out during elaborate ceremonies held on Blood Mountain during new moon periods. Witnesses described rituals that combined elements of frontier justice with practices that seemed borrowed from much darker traditions. The Blackwoods would don identical black robes and masks, making it impossible to determine which brother was actually carrying out the sentence. What made these ceremonies particularly terrifying was their theatrical nature. The Blackwoods had constructed a natural amphitheater on the mountain's peak, complete with stone seating and a central platform where their twisted justice was administered. They would force entire communities to attend these events, understanding that witnessing such brutality would ensure compliance for months afterward. Those who refused to attend found their homes marked with strange symbols carved into trees or painted on walls, identifying them as future candidates for blood debt collection. The Blackwood operation finally collapsed in 1889 when their theatrical approach proved to be their downfall. During one of their ceremonies, a group of Georgia Rangers who had been tracking the family for months managed to position themselves around the mountain amphitheater. The very isolation that had protected the Blackwoods for so long worked against them when they found themselves surrounded with no escape route. The ensuing battle lasted from sunset until dawn, with the twins using their intimate knowledge of the mountain's caves and crevices to evade capture. When morning finally came, both brothers had been killed, though their bodies were found in different locations nearly a mile apart. Even in death, they had maintained their mystique of being able to exist in multiple places simultaneously. 3. The Grim Dynasty of Widow's Hollow. In the remote valleys of West Virginia, where morning mist clung to the mountainsides like smoke from ancient fires, the Grimm family established what historians would later describe as the most sophisticated criminal empire in Appalachian history. Operating from their stronghold in Widow's Hollow between 1880 and 1915, this family combined business acumen with brutal enforcement tactics to control illegal activities across 4 states. The dynasty was founded by Heinrich Grimm, a German immigrant who arrived in America with a background in both legitimate business and what European authorities delicately termed alternative commerce. Heinrich understood that successful criminal enterprises required the same organizational principles as legitimate businesses: clear hierarchies, defined territories, efficient operations, and strategic planning. Under his leadership, the Grimm family transformed from a small group of mountain bandits into a criminal corporation that would have impressed modern organized crime families. Their primary operation involved controlling the flow of illegal goods throughout the Appalachian region. The Grimms established a network of safe houses, communication systems, and transportation routes that allowed them to move contraband efficiently while avoiding law enforcement. They dealt in everything from stolen livestock and moonshine to more exotic commodities like rare minerals illegally extracted from government lands and weapons sold to various feuding mountain families. What set the Grimms apart was their approach to violence. While other mountain families used brutality as their primary tool, the Grimms employed it strategically and sparingly, understanding that excessive violence drew unwanted attention from federal authorities. They developed a reputation for being reasonable business partners who honored their agreements, but absolutely ruthless toward anyone who betrayed their trust or interfered with their operations. Heinrich's three sons, Klaus, Otto, and Wilhelm, each controlled different aspects of the family business. Klaus managed the financial operations, maintaining detailed records and ensuring that profits were properly laundered through legitimate businesses the family had established in various towns. Otto handled enforcement and security, training family members in military tactics, and maintaining the network of informants that kept the family ahead of law enforcement efforts. Wilhelm managed logistics, overseeing the transportation networks and safe houses that formed the backbone of their operations. The Grimm family's downfall began in 1912, when they made the strategic error of expanding their operations into urban areas where they lacked the geographical advantages that had protected them in the mountains. A series of arrests in Charleston and Pittsburgh led to federal investigations that gradually exposed the scope of their criminal network. By 1915, all three brothers had been either killed in shootouts with federal agents or captured and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. 4. The Ravencroft Circle of Bone Valley. Hidden deep in the most inaccessible regions of the Virginia mountains, where even experienced hunters lost their way and cartographers left blank spaces on their maps, the Ravencroft family created something that transcended ordinary criminal activity. Between 1870 and 1920, they established what can only be described as an alternative society, complete with its own laws, customs, and terrifying rituals that bound their followers through a combination of fear and fanatical loyalty. The family was led by Mordecai Ravencroft, a former preacher who had been expelled from his congregation for practices that his fellow clergy found disturbing. Mordecai possessed the rare combination of intellectual brilliance and complete moral flexibility that allowed him to create a belief system perfectly designed to serve his family's criminal ambitions. He understood that people would endure almost any hardship and commit almost any crime if they believed they were serving a higher purpose. Under Mordecai's guidance, the Ravencrofts developed what they called the Circle, a hierarchical organization that combined elements of religious cult, criminal syndicate, and primitive government. New members underwent initiation ceremonies held in natural caverns throughout Bone Valley, rituals that allegedly involved blood oaths and demonstrations of absolute loyalty to the Ravencroft family. Those who completed the initiation process were marked with distinctive tattoos and considered bound to the family for life. The Circle's criminal activities were unlike anything seen elsewhere in the mountains. Rather than focusing on traditional crimes like robbery or moonshining, the Ravencrofts specialized in what modern law enforcement would recognize as human trafficking. They maintained a network of contacts throughout the eastern United States, providing various forms of forced labor to mines, logging operations, and private individuals who asked no questions about the origins of their workers. Their recruitment methods were particularly insidious. Ravencroft family members would pose as charitable organizations, offering assistance to desperate families during economic hardships or natural disasters. Once families accepted help, they found themselves gradually drawn into a web of debt and obligation that eventually resulted in complete servitude. Children were separated from parents and raised within the Circle ensuring a steady supply of new members who knew no other way of life. What made the Ravencrofts especially dangerous was their ability to operate in plain sight. Mordecai had established legitimate businesses in several towns, including general stores, lumber mills, and even a small bank. These enterprises served as fronts for money laundering while providing the family with detailed intelligence about potential victims and law enforcement activities. Local authorities who grew suspicious often found themselves facing financial pressure or personal threats that convinced them to look the other way. The family's compound in Bone Valley was described by the few outsiders who saw it as resembling a medieval fortress more than a mountain homestead. High wooden walls surrounded dozens of buildings, including workshops where kidnapped craftsmen were forced to produce goods for sale in the family's legitimate businesses. Guard towers provided early warning of approaching strangers, while an elaborate system of bells and signal fires allowed rapid communication throughout their territory. Federal investigators finally penetrated the Ravencroft operation in 1919 when a young woman managed to escape from their compound and reach authorities in Richmond. Her testimony revealed the scope of their activities and provided crucial intelligence about the layout of their stronghold. The subsequent raid involved over 100 federal agents and took 3 days to complete, as the Ravencrofts had prepared their compound to withstand a siege. When agents finally breached the main buildings, they discovered evidence of crimes spanning 5 decades. Detailed records documented thousands of victims, including children who had been sold to buyers as far away as California and Mexico. Most disturbing were the journals kept by Mordecai himself, which revealed a man who had convinced himself that his actions served some greater cosmic purpose that justified any amount of human suffering. 5. The Ashford Confederacy of Devil's Den. In the labyrinthine cave systems of northern Alabama, where underground rivers carved passages through limestone mountains, the Ashford family established the most impenetrable criminal stronghold in the entire Appalachian region. Operating from 1885 to 1928, they created a subterranean empire that allowed them to control illegal activities across 3 states while remaining virtually untouchable by conventional law enforcement methods. The family patriarch, Colonel Jefferson Ashford, had served with distinction in the Confederate Army before deserting during the final months of the Civil War. His military experience proved invaluable in organizing what he called the Confederacy, a network of criminal associates who operated under strict military discipline while maintaining absolute loyalty to the Ashford family name. Jefferson understood that traditional mountain hideouts were vulnerable to determined pursuit, so he moved his operations underground. The caves of Devil's Den provided natural advantages that no surface fortress could match: multiple entrances and exits, rooms large enough to house dozens of people, underground streams that provided fresh water, and passages that connected to cave systems extending for hundreds of miles in every direction. The Ashfords' primary criminal activity involved counterfeiting, an operation that required both technical skill and secure facilities. Deep within the cave system, they established workshops equipped with printing presses, engraving tools, and chemical processing equipment smuggled in piece by piece over several years. Their counterfeit currency was so expertly crafted that it often passed undetected even when examined by bank officials, allowing the family to flood the regional economy with fake money while accumulating genuine wealth. Their secondary operations included arms dealing and providing sanctuary for wanted criminals from across the southeastern United States. The Ashford Caves became known throughout the criminal underworld as a place where anyone could disappear for the right price, regardless of what crimes they had committed. This sanctuary service provided the family with valuable intelligence about law enforcement activities, while creating a network of dangerous allies who could be called upon when needed. What made the Ashfords particularly formidable was their use of the cave system for psychological warfare. They would kidnap enemies or troublesome witnesses and hold them in complete darkness, deep underground, where the constant sound of dripping water and absolute isolation quickly broke down mental resistance. Many victims emerged from these experiences permanently changed, either completely loyal to the Ashford family or so psychologically damaged that their testimony was considered unreliable by authorities. The family's military organization included specialized roles that took advantage of their unique environment. Cave runners maintained communication between different sections of the underground complex, memorizing the locations of hidden supplies and escape routes. Surface scouts monitored approaches to the various cave entrances, using a system of coded signals to warn of approaching danger. Technical specialists maintained the counterfeiting equipment and developed new methods for producing increasingly sophisticated fake documents. Colonel Jefferson's 3 sons each commanded different aspects of the operation. Marcus controlled external relations, maintaining contacts with criminal organizations throughout the region while managing the sanctuary service that provided refuge for wanted criminals. Samuel oversaw the counterfeiting operation, constantly refining their techniques and expanding into new forms of document fraud. Thomas commanded security operations, training family members in combat tactics and developing the psychological techniques used to break prisoners held in the caves. The Ashford Confederacy's downfall came not through direct assault, but through patient investigation by federal agents who spent years mapping the cave system and identifying all possible entrances. In 1928, coordinated raids sealed every known entrance to Devil's Den, while specially trained cave explorers penetrated the underground complex from previously unknown passages. The battle that followed lasted for nearly a week, with fighting occurring in absolute darkness through narrow passages where traditional military advantages meant nothing. When the caves were finally secured, investigators discovered an underground city that had housed over 200 people. The counterfeiting operation alone had been responsible for millions of dollars in fake currency circulating throughout the southeastern United States. Most shocking was the discovery of a prison complex deep within the cave system, where dozens of victims had been held for years in conditions that defied human comprehension. 6. The Thorn Collective of Serpent's Ridge. Perched along the razor-sharp ridgeline that divided Tennessee from North Carolina, where winter winds howled through gaps in the mountains like the screams of the damned, the Thorn family created a criminal enterprise built on their mastery of the most dangerous terrain in the entire Appalachian chain. From their stronghold on Serpent's Ridge, they controlled mountain passes that were essential for trade and travel, turning geography itself into their most powerful weapon. The family was established by Ezekiel Thorne in 1878, a man whose intimate knowledge of the mountain wilderness had been earned through 20 years. As a hunting guide and trapper, Ezekiel understood that controlling the high ridges meant controlling everything that moved through the valleys below, and he possessed the mountaineering skills necessary to establish permanent settlements in locations that others considered completely inaccessible. The Thorns specialized in what they called toll collecting, though their methods bore no resemblance to legitimate taxation. They identified the most treacherous sections of mountain trails, places where travelers were already struggling with dangerous conditions and couldn't easily turn back or find alternative routes. At these vulnerable points, they would demand payment for safe passage, but their definition of safety included protection from hazards that the Thorns themselves had created. Their territory was honeycombed with man-made avalanche triggers, rope bridges that could be cut without warning, and hidden pitfalls concealed along seemingly safe paths. Travelers who refused to pay the Thorn toll would find their journey becoming increasingly perilous, as family members used their knowledge of the terrain to create life-threatening situations that appeared to be natural accidents. What made the Thorns particularly feared was their apparent immunity to the mountain conditions that killed others. Family members could traverse ice-covered ridges in winter storms, navigate fog-shrouded passes in complete darkness, and survive for weeks in the wilderness with minimal supplies. This reputation for supernatural mountain skills was carefully cultivated through generations of specialized training that began in the early childhood. Thorn children were raised in conditions that would have killed most adults. They learned to climb sheer rock faces before they could properly walk, to predict weather changes by subtle signs invisible to others, and to move through the mountains in absolute silence regardless of conditions. By adolescence, each family member possessed survival skills that bordered on the supernatural, making them perfectly adapted to their harsh environment while remaining completely alien to civilized society. The family's criminal network extended far beyond simple toll collecting. They operated smuggling routes that moved illegal goods between states, taking advantage of their control over remote mountain passes that other criminals couldn't navigate safely. They also provided assassination services, using their mountaineering skills to eliminate targets in locations where conventional killers couldn't operate effectively. Their most notorious operation involved the systematic looting of isolated mountain communities during severe winter storms. When blizzards cut off small settlements from outside contact, Thorn family members would descend from the high ridges like wolves, taking whatever they wanted while weather conditions made pursuit impossible. By the time spring thaw allowed authorities to investigate, the Thorns had vanished back to their mountain strongholds, leaving behind communities too terrorized to provide useful testimony. The Thorn reign finally ended in 1924 during an unusually severe winter that trapped the entire family on Serpent's Ridge for nearly 3 months. Federal agents, working with experienced mountain climbers recruited from the military, used the same weather conditions that had always protected the Thorns to finally corner them in their mountain fortress. The siege lasted until spring, with both sides enduring conditions that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. When the weather finally cleared enough for the final assault, investigators found that most of the Thorne family had perished during the winter, victims of the same harsh conditions they had used as weapons for so many years. The few survivors were so psychologically damaged by months of isolation and starvation that they provided little useful intelligence about the family's operations. However, the Thorne legacy lived on in the form of their extensively modified mountain environment. For decades afterward, travelers in the region continued to fall victim to the elaborate trap systems the family had installed throughout their territory. Even today, certain sections of the Appalachian Trail in that region remain closed due to what park rangers diplomatically describe as unstable geological conditions. 7. The Vance Brotherhood of Hellhound Gorge. Deep in the most remote sections of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where ancient Cherokee legends spoke of places where the spirit world bled through into reality, the Vance family established a criminal operation that defied every conventional understanding of mountain outlaws. Between 1892 and 1931, they controlled a territory so isolated that mapmakers often omitted it entirely, creating a kingdom of shadows where their own twisted version of justice reigned supreme. The Brotherhood was founded by 3 Vance brothers who had fled Kentucky after a coal mine dispute turned deadly. Caleb, the eldest, possessed an almost supernatural ability to track human beings across any terrain. Josiah, the middle brother, had served as a Confederate sniper and could kill silently from distances that seemed impossible. Micah, the youngest, understood explosives and demolition with the expertise of a trained engineer, despite having no formal education. What made the Vance Brotherhood unique among mountain criminals was their systematic approach to territorial control. Rather than simply claiming a region and defending it, they actively reshaped the landscape to serve their purposes. Using Micah's explosive expertise, they created artificial landslides that blocked established trails while opening new passages known only to family members. They diverted streams to flood valleys they wanted to keep clear of intruders while creating hidden water sources for their own use. Their criminal specialty involved what locals called soul trading, a practice that went far beyond conventional kidnapping or slavery. The Vances would identify individuals with specific skills or knowledge they needed, then orchestrate elaborate scenarios to force these people into their service. A blacksmith might find his family threatened unless he relocated to Hellhound Gorge to maintain Vance weapons and tools. A doctor might discover that his medical supplies were being systematically stolen until he agreed to provide exclusive services to the Brotherhood. Unlike other mountain families who relied on fear and intimidation, the Vances understood the power of creating genuine loyalty among their followers. They established what amounted to a feudal system where those who served the family faithfully were rewarded with protection, steady work, and a share in the Brotherhood's profits. Many of their followers had originally been victims who gradually came to see the Vances as protectors rather than captors. The family compound in Hellhound Gorge was described by federal investigators as resembling a medieval fortress built into the living rock of the mountain itself. Natural caves had been expanded and connected to create an underground city that could house over 300 people during emergencies. Above ground, wooden structures built into the cliff faces provided additional living space, while remaining nearly invisible to anyone approaching from the valley floor. Their most disturbing practice involved what they called blood inheritance, a twisted system of succession that ensured the Brotherhood's survival across generations. When Vance family members died, their children were required to prove their worthiness by completing increasingly dangerous tasks that tested their loyalty, intelligence, and capacity for violence. Those who failed these tests simply disappeared, while successful candidates gained full membership in the Brotherhood, along with detailed knowledge of the family's criminal operations. The Vances maintained their power through an intelligence network that rivaled anything created by legitimate governments. They had informants in towns across 3 states, individuals who provided detailed reports on law enforcement activities, potential victims, and opportunities for new criminal ventures. This information was transmitted through a complex system of coded messages hidden in seemingly innocent correspondence between legitimate businesses the family had established as fronts. Their downfall began in 1929 when the Great Depression disrupted the economic systems they had manipulated for decades. As legitimate businesses failed and banks collapsed, the Vances found themselves cut off from the financial networks they had used to launder their profits and maintain their far-reaching intelligence operations. Federal agents, suddenly freed from other priorities as crime rates soared nationwide, began focusing resources on long-standing problems like the Vance Brotherhood. The final assault on Hellhound Gorge in 1931 required the largest law enforcement operation in Appalachian history up to that point. Over 400 federal agents, state police, and National Guard troops surrounded the gorge while specially trained cave fighters prepared to assault the underground fortress. The battle lasted for 6 days, with fighting occurring simultaneously above and below ground as the Vances used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to mount a desperate defense. When the compound finally fell, investigators discovered evidence of crimes spanning 4 decades. The Brotherhood had been responsible for hundreds of disappearances, millions of dollars in theft and fraud, and a level of territorial control that had effectively removed entire sections of the mountains from federal jurisdiction. Most shocking was the discovery that several individuals listed as missing persons had actually been living within the compound for years, so thoroughly indoctrinated into the Vance system that they refused to leave even when offered freedom by federal authorities. 8. The Corbett Syndicate of Widow's Peak. Along the jagged summit of Widow's Peak in eastern Tennessee, where winter storms could kill unprepared travelers in minutes and summer heat created deadly dehydration, the Corbett family established a criminal enterprise that combined traditional mountain outlawry with innovations that wouldn't have seemed out of place in modern organized crime. Operating from 1895 to 1933, they created a network of illegal activities that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River while maintaining their mountain stronghold as an impenetrable base of operations. The syndicate was founded by Augustus Corbett, a former railroad engineer who understood both the importance of transportation networks and the vulnerabilities inherent in industrial systems. Augustus had worked for several major rail lines before a workplace accident left him permanently disabled and bitter toward the corporate interests that had discarded him without compensation. His intimate knowledge of railroad operations became the foundation for criminal activities that would eventually threaten the economic stability of the entire southeastern United States. The Corbetts specialized in what they called iron piracy, systematic attacks on railroad infrastructure that went far beyond simple train robbery. They would study shipping schedules and cargo manifests to identify the most valuable targets, then use explosives and mechanical sabotage to derail trains at carefully chosen locations where rescue would be difficult and cargo recovery nearly impossible. Their knowledge of railroad construction allowed them to create derailments that appeared to be accidents, making it difficult for authorities to distinguish between criminal activity and equipment failure. What set the Corbett Syndicate apart was their approach to disposing of stolen goods. Rather than trying to sell railroad cargo through traditional criminal networks, they established their own distribution system that operated like a legitimate business. Stolen merchandise was transported to hidden warehouses throughout the region, where it was repackaged and sold through front companies that the Corbetts had established in major cities. This approach allowed them to move much larger quantities of stolen goods while avoiding the suspicion that would have accompanied attempts to fence railroad cargo through existing criminal channels. The family's mountain stronghold served as both headquarters and fortress, with modifications that reflected Augustus's engineering background. The compound was connected to the outside world through a narrow-gauge railroad that the Corbetts had built themselves, allowing them to move heavy equipment and large quantities of goods without relying on roads that could be blocked by law enforcement. The track was designed with numerous switchbacks and hidden sidings that would allow defenders to derail pursuing trains while providing escape routes for family members. Augustus's 3 sons each managed different aspects of the syndicate's operations. Benjamin controlled the actual train attacks, leading crews of specialists who could disable locomotives and crack railroad safes with professional efficiency. Solomon managed the distribution network, maintaining relationships with corrupt businessmen in major cities who helped launder stolen goods through legitimate commerce. Jeremiah handled security and intelligence, developing an information network that provided advance warning of law enforcement activities while identifying new targets for the family's criminal enterprises. The Corbett Syndicate's most audacious operation occurred in 1923 when they successfully hijacked an entire freight train carrying gold bullion from the Federal Mint in Philadelphia. The robbery required months of planning and involved coordinating attacks at 3 different points along the rail line to prevent authorities from determining where the actual theft had occurred. The stolen gold was never recovered, though federal investigators suspected it had been melted down and sold through the Corbetts' established distribution channels. Their criminal network eventually included partnerships with corrupt officials in railroad companies, police departments, and even federal agencies. The Corbetts understood that information was often more valuable than stolen goods, and they paid well for advance notice of law enforcement operations, shipping schedules for valuable cargo, and details about security procedures at major rail terminals. This intelligence allowed them to stay ahead of pursuing authorities while identifying increasingly profitable targets for their attacks. The syndicate's downfall came not through law enforcement action, but through technological changes that made their criminal specialty obsolete. As railroad companies improved their security systems and federal authorities developed better coordination between different agencies, train robbery became increasingly difficult and dangerous. The Corbetts attempted to adapt by moving into bootlegging during Prohibition, but they lacked the connections and expertise necessary to compete with established criminal organizations in that field. Federal agents finally cornered the remaining Corbett family members in 1933 during a raid that was intended to be routine enforcement of Prohibition laws. The agents had expected to find a small moonshine operation, but instead discovered evidence of the syndicate's decades-long campaign against railroad infrastructure. The ensuing battle destroyed much of the Corbett compound and left most of the family dead, though rumors persisted for years that some members had escaped through their private railroad system and established new criminal operations elsewhere. 9. The Mullen Empire of Devil's Staircase. Carved into the nearly vertical cliff faces of what locals called Devil's Staircase, where ancient geological forces had created a maze of natural ledges and hidden caves accessible only to the most skilled climbers, the Mullen family built a criminal empire that combined mountain banditry with psychological warfare so sophisticated it wouldn't have seemed out of place in modern intelligence operations. From 1888 to 1935, they controlled a territory that existed more in vertical space than horizontal, creating a three-dimensional kingdom that law enforcement couldn't penetrate using conventional tactics. The empire was established by Patrick Mullen, an Irish immigrant who had fled his homeland after being involved in revolutionary activities against British rule. Patrick brought with him not only a deep hatred of governmental authority, but also organizational skills learned from years of underground political work. He understood that successful resistance movements required careful planning, absolute loyalty, and the ability to blend legitimate activities with clandestine operations. Patrick's first innovation was recognizing that the cliff faces of Devil's Staircase provided defensive advantages that no conventional fortress could match. Attackers would have to climb exposed rock faces while defenders fired down from protected positions. Supply lines could be established through cave systems that were completely invisible from below. Most importantly, the vertical nature of the terrain meant that even experienced mountain fighters would be operating outside their normal environment, giving the Mullens advantages that their knowledge and preparation could maximize. The family's criminal operations focused on what they called vertical piracy, attacks on travelers and settlements that took advantage of their ability to appear and disappear along cliff faces that others considered impassable. Mullen family members could descend from hidden positions hundreds of feet above their targets, strike quickly, and retreat to positions where pursuit was impossible. Their signature calling card was leaving rope ladders hanging from cliff faces after successful attacks, taunting authorities with evidence of escape routes they couldn't follow. What made the Mullen Empire particularly terrifying was their use of psychological manipulation techniques that Patrick had learned during his revolutionary activities in Ireland. They would conduct reconnaissance on their targets for weeks or months before attacking, learning personal details about family members, business associates, and individual fears or weaknesses. When they finally struck, they would demonstrate knowledge that seemed impossible to obtain, creating the impression that they possessed supernatural intelligence-gathering abilities. Their mountain stronghold was a masterpiece of vertical engineering that incorporated both natural caves and artificial construction. Living spaces were carved directly into the cliff face, connected by narrow ledges and rope bridges that could be quickly cut to prevent access by enemies. Supply storage was distributed throughout multiple levels, ensuring that the loss of any single position wouldn't compromise the entire operation. Most impressive was their water system, which captured mountain springs and distributed fresh water throughout the vertical compound using a gravity-fed network of bamboo pipes. Patrick's 4 sons each specialized in different aspects of the Empire's operations, creating a division of labor that maximized their effectiveness while minimizing their vulnerabilities. Sean managed intelligence gathering, maintaining a network of informants who provided detailed information about potential targets and law enforcement activities. Brian controlled the actual climbing operations, training family members in the specialized techniques necessary to operate effectively on vertical terrain. Connor handled logistics, ensuring that the cliffside compound remained supplied with food, weapons, and equipment despite its inaccessible location. Liam managed external relations, maintaining contacts with other criminal organizations while negotiating the sale of stolen goods through established black market channels. The Mullen family's most notorious operation involved the systematic terrorization of the entire valley community over the course of 3 years. Rather than simply robbing their victims and moving on, they conducted what amounted to a psychological warfare campaign designed to demonstrate their complete control over the region. Residents would wake to find personal items moved or stolen during the night, messages carved into trees visible from their windows, or evidence that their homes had been entered while they slept. The campaign escalated to include family members being kidnapped for short periods, during which they were held in caves high on the cliff faces and subjected to interrogation about their neighbors' activities, financial resources, and potential resistance to Mullen control. Victims were then released with detailed messages to deliver to specific individuals, creating a network of unwilling informants who were too terrified to refuse cooperation with the family's intelligence-gathering efforts. Federal authorities struggled for years to develop effective tactics against the Mullen Empire, as conventional law enforcement methods were completely inadequate for dealing with criminals who operated primarily in vertical terrain. Early attempts to assault the cliffside compound resulted in disasters that cost several agents their lives while accomplishing nothing beyond demonstrating the impossibility of direct attack. The breakthrough came in 1934 when federal authorities recruited a team of experienced mountain climbers from the military and trained them specifically for operations against the Mullen stronghold. The assault team spent months learning specialized climbing techniques and developing equipment designed for combat in vertical environments. When they finally attacked in 1935, they approached the Mullen compound from above, rappelling down from the mountain peak in a coordinated assault that caught the family completely by surprise. The battle that followed was unlike anything in American law enforcement history, with combat occurring on narrow ledges hundreds of feet above the valley floor. The Mullens fought desperately, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to mount a determined defense, but they were ultimately overwhelmed by attackers who had trained specifically to neutralize their advantages. When the compound finally fell, investigators discovered a vertical city that had housed over 150 people in conditions that defied conventional understanding of human habitation. 10. The Stark Confederation of Thunder Gap, where lightning strikes carved channels through solid granite and thunder echoed for miles through narrow mountain passes. The Stark family established what historians would later recognize as the most militarily sophisticated criminal organization in Appalachian history. Operating from their fortress at Thunder Gap between 1901 and 1938, they created a confederation of allied criminal groups that controlled illegal activities across 6 states while maintaining discipline and organization that rivaled legitimate military units. The Confederation was founded by Colonel Marcus Stark, a West Point graduate who had resigned his commission after a court-martial for conduct unbecoming an officer. Marcus brought to criminal enterprise the same strategic thinking and organizational skills that had made him successful in legitimate military service, understanding that criminal organizations failed when they lacked discipline, clear command structures, and long-term strategic planning. Marcus's first innovation was recognizing that traditional mountain criminal families were limited by their isolation and inability to coordinate activities across large territories. He began reaching out to other criminal groups throughout the region, offering them military training, organizational support, and coordination services in exchange for loyalty and a percentage of their profits. Within 5 years, the Stark Confederation included over 20 allied groups operating under unified command and strategic direction. The Confederation's military structure was based on Marcus's understanding of conventional army organization, but adapted to the unique requirements of criminal enterprise in mountain terrain. Each allied group maintained its traditional leadership and local autonomy, but accepted Stark family members as strategic advisors and liaison officers. Major operations were planned at the Confederation level, with individual groups contributing specialized capabilities to larger criminal enterprises that no single family could have attempted alone. Their primary criminal activity involved large-scale smuggling operations that moved illegal goods between major cities while avoiding federal law enforcement through careful route planning and intelligence coordination. The Confederation maintained detailed maps of law enforcement patrol patterns, safe houses, and supply caches throughout their territory, allowing them to move contraband efficiently while minimizing exposure to arrest or confiscation. What made the Stark Confederation particularly dangerous was their approach to dealing with law enforcement. Rather than simply avoiding federal agents, they actively gathered intelligence on law enforcement activities and used this information to stay ahead of investigations while identifying opportunities to eliminate particularly troublesome officials. Their intelligence network included corrupt contacts within federal agencies, local police departments, and even military installations, providing them with advance warning of raids and detailed information about ongoing investigations. Marcus's 3 sons each commanded different branches of the Confederation's operations, creating a command structure that could continue functioning even if individual leaders were captured or killed. Alexander controlled intelligence operations, managing the network of informants and corrupt officials that kept the Confederation ahead of law enforcement efforts. Theodore commanded field operations, coordinating smuggling activities and managing relationships with allied criminal groups. Nathaniel handled logistics and supply, ensuring that Confederation members had access to weapons, equipment, and safe transportation throughout their territory. The Confederation's mountain fortress at Thunder Gap was designed according to military engineering principles, with overlapping fields of fire, multiple defensive positions, and carefully planned escape routes that would allow defenders to conduct fighting withdrawals if the main position became untenable. The facility included barracks for over 200 fighters, armories stocked with military-grade weapons, and communication equipment that allowed coordination with allied groups throughout the region. Their most ambitious operation occurred in 1925, when the Confederation successfully coordinated simultaneous attacks on federal facilities in 4 different states, creating chaos that allowed them to steal military weapons and equipment, while law enforcement resources were spread too thin to respond effectively. The operation required months of planning and demonstrated organizational capabilities that shocked federal authorities, who had previously viewed mountain criminals as unsophisticated bandits. The Confederation's intelligence operations eventually became so sophisticated that they were able to predict federal law enforcement activities with remarkable accuracy, allowing them to avoid major raids while continuing to expand their criminal enterprises. Federal agents found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by criminals who seemed to know their plans before they were fully developed, leading to frustration and calls for new approaches to dealing with organized mountain crime. The Stark Confederation's downfall came not through direct law enforcement action, but through internal conflicts that Marcus's military discipline couldn't prevent indefinitely. As the organization grew larger and more profitable, allied groups began competing for resources and territory while questioning the authority of Stark family leadership. These tensions exploded into open warfare in 1937, when several allied groups attempted to break away from Confederation control while retaining access to Stark intelligence networks and supply systems. The resulting conflict weakened the Confederation enough that federal authorities were finally able to mount successful operations against their mountain strongholds. The assault on Thunder Gap in 1938 involved over 600 federal agents and National Guard troops in what amounted to a military campaign rather than a law enforcement operation. The battle lasted for nearly 2 weeks, with the Starks using their military training to mount a professional defense that inflicted heavy casualties on attacking forces. When Thunder Gap finally fell, investigators discovered evidence of criminal activities that had generated millions of dollars in profits while compromising law enforcement effectiveness throughout the southeastern United States. Most disturbing was the revelation that the Confederation had been planning to expand their operations into legitimate political activities, with Marcus Stark apparently believing that his organizational skills could be used to gain actual governmental power in several mountain counties. 11. The Crane Dominion of Skull Rock Mesa. Perched atop the most forbidding peak in the entire Appalachian chain, where howling winds and treacherous weather made approach nearly impossible 9 months of the year, the Crane family established the final and perhaps most terrifying criminal dynasty in mountain history. From their stronghold on Skull Rock Mesa, they controlled a territory that existed as much in legend and fear as in physical reality, creating a dominion that lasted from 1905 until 1941 and left scars on the regional psyche that persist to this day. The Dominion was founded by Ezra Crane, a man whose background remained mysterious, even to federal investigators who spent decades trying to unravel his origins. What was known was that Ezra possessed an almost supernatural understanding of human psychology combined with organizational abilities that allowed him to create the most feared criminal enterprise in Appalachian history. Unlike other mountain families who relied primarily on violence or intimidation, the Cranes understood that true power came from controlling what people believed about reality itself. Ezra's first innovation was recognizing that the most effective form of control wasn't physical force, but psychological dominance that made resistance seem impossible. He began cultivating an aura of supernatural ability by demonstrating knowledge that seemed impossible for any mortal person to possess. Crane family members would approach strangers and casually mention personal details about their lives, family histories, and secret fears that no one else could have known. This apparent omniscience created a reputation for otherworldly powers that made the Cranes seem less like criminals and more like forces of nature. The family's criminal operations centered around what they called destiny manipulation, a practice that went far beyond conventional extortion or theft. The Cranes would identify individuals with wealth, influence, or useful skills, then orchestrate elaborate scenarios designed to convince these people that their fate was somehow intertwined with Crane family interests. Victims would find themselves experiencing a series of seemingly unrelated events that gradually led them to believe that cooperation with the Cranes was not just advisable, but inevitable. Their methods were so sophisticated that many victims never realized they were being manipulated. A wealthy businessman might experience a series of minor setbacks that could be easily resolved through partnership with Crane Enterprises. A local sheriff might discover that his most difficult cases became mysteriously solvable after consulting with Crane family members. A judge might find that his most challenging legal decisions were simplified when he took advice from the mysterious strangers who seemed to appear whenever he needed guidance most. What made the Crane Dominion particularly terrifying was their ability to operate simultaneously in the physical and psychological realms. Their mountain stronghold on Skull Rock Mesa was real enough, a fortress carved from living stone that commanded views across hundreds of miles of mountain territory. But their true power lay in the network of believers, informants, and willing collaborators they had created throughout the region through decades of careful psychological manipulation. The mesa itself was accessible only through a single narrow path that wound up the cliff face through a series of switchbacks so treacherous that even experienced climbers often turned back rather than attempt the ascent. The Cranes had modified this natural barrier by installing hidden traps, false paths, and observation points that allowed them to monitor approaching visitors while remaining completely invisible themselves. Most visitors who attempted to reach the mesa reported becoming disoriented and confused, often finding themselves back at the base of the mountain with no clear memory of how they had gotten there. Ezra's 5 children each controlled different aspects of the Dominion's operations, creating a system so complex that federal investigators never fully understood how it functioned. Mordecai managed what the family called the Vision Network, a system of informants who provided detailed intelligence about activities throughout their territory while believing they were serving some higher spiritual purpose. Delilah controlled the family's financial operations, laundering criminal profits through a maze of legitimate businesses that seemed to prosper regardless of economic conditions. Gideon handled enforcement activities, though his methods were so subtle that victims often didn't realize they were being punished until it was too late to resist. Miriam managed the family's recruitment efforts, identifying potential new members and gradually drawing them into the Dominion's sphere of influence. Caleb controlled external relations, maintaining contacts with other criminal organizations while ensuring that the Crane family's true capabilities remained hidden from potential enemies. The Dominion's most disturbing practice involved what they called soul binding, a process that went far beyond simple criminal recruitment. Individuals who became involved with the Crane family often found their entire worldview gradually reshaped until they genuinely believed that serving the Cranes was not just their duty, but their destiny. These converts would abandon their previous lives, families, and identities to become completely devoted to whatever purposes the Crane family assigned them. The psychological techniques used in this process were so effective that many converts remained loyal even after the Dominion's eventual collapse. Federal investigators interviewing former Crane associates found that many couldn't even explain why they had served the family, only that it had seemed like the natural and inevitable thing to do at the time. Some described feeling as though they had been living in a dream during their time with the Cranes, unable to distinguish between reality and the elaborate psychological constructs the family had created. Their mountain fortress reflected the same combination of physical and psychological elements that characterized all Crane operations. The buildings were constructed from local stone using architectural techniques that created optical illusions and acoustic effects designed to disorient visitors. Corridors seemed to stretch longer than they actually were. Rooms appeared larger or smaller depending on viewing angle, and the constant sound of wind through carefully positioned openings created an atmosphere of otherworldly mystery. The Dominion maintained its power through a combination of genuine criminal activities and elaborate psychological theater that made their true capabilities impossible to assess. They were known to have been involved in kidnapping, extortion, and murder, but they were also credited with supernatural powers, prophetic abilities, and influence over natural forces that no rational person could actually possess. This deliberate blurring of reality and fantasy made them nearly impossible for law enforcement to investigate using conventional methods. Federal authorities struggled for decades to develop effective strategies against the Crane Dominion, as traditional investigative techniques proved completely inadequate for dealing with a criminal organization that operated primarily through psychological manipulation. Undercover agents sent to infiltrate the family often emerged months later with confused memories and mysterious gaps in their recollections. Witnesses provided testimony that was so contradictory and fantastic that it was useless in court proceedings. The breakthrough came in 1940, when federal authorities recruited a team of psychologists and psychiatrists to analyze crane operations from a mental health perspective rather than a conventional law enforcement approach. These specialists identified the techniques the cranes were using to manipulate their victims and developed countermeasures that allowed investigators to resist psychological manipulation while gathering useful intelligence about the family's actual criminal activities. The final assault on Skull Rock Mesa in 1941 required careful coordination between law enforcement officers and mental health professionals who could help investigators distinguish between genuine threats and psychological manipulation designed to create fear and confusion. The operation took 3 months to complete, as federal agents had to carefully document each aspect of the crane operation while ensuring that they themselves didn't fall victim to the family's psychological techniques. When the Mesa Fortress finally fell, investigators discovered evidence of crimes spanning 4 decades. But they also found something more disturbing: detailed records documenting psychological experiments that the cranes had conducted on hundreds of victims over the years. These records revealed a systematic effort to understand and exploit human psychological vulnerabilities that went far beyond anything necessary for simple criminal enterprise. The Crane family members who survived the final assault were scattered to different federal facilities, where they were held in isolation to prevent them from coordinating their psychological manipulation techniques against their captors. Even in custody, they continued to demonstrate abilities that seemed to transcend normal human capabilities, though psychiatric evaluation eventually revealed that their apparent supernatural powers were actually sophisticated applications of psychology, suggestion, and carefully orchestrated deception. The legacy of these 11 family dynasties extends far beyond their individual crimes or the territories they once controlled. Together, they created a shadow history of American law enforcement, demonstrating the limitations of conventional justice systems when confronted with criminals who understood that true power came not from simple violence, but from systematic exploitation of human psychology, geography, and social structures. Their collective reign of terror lasted for nearly a century, during which they controlled territories larger than some entire states, while operating completely outside the reach of federal authority. They developed criminal techniques that wouldn't be seen again until the rise of modern organized crime, and they created psychological warfare methods that anticipated developments in military and intelligence operations by decades. Perhaps most significantly, these families revealed the extent to which isolated communities could be dominated by individuals who combined ruthless ambition with sophisticated understanding of human nature. They showed that in the absence of effective governmental authority, criminal organizations could evolve into something resembling primitive states, complete with their own laws, customs, and systems of justice that bore no resemblance to civilized society. The mountain regions they once controlled still bear scars from their activities. Certain valleys remain sparsely populated, certain trails are still avoided by experienced hikers, and certain peaks are still associated with stories that parents use to keep children from wandering too far into the wilderness. Local historians have documented persistent reports of strange phenomena in areas once controlled by these families, though whether these represent genuine supernatural activity or simply the lingering psychological effects of decades of terror remains a matter of debate. Federal law enforcement agencies learned crucial lessons from their struggles against these mountain dynasties, lessons that influenced the development of modern investigative techniques, criminal profiling methods, and interagency coordination procedures. The specialized training programs developed to deal with the Crane Dominion's psychological manipulation techniques became the foundation for modern counterintelligence training, while the tactical innovations required to assault fortified mountain positions influenced military special operations doctrine for decades. But perhaps the most important legacy of these 11 families lies in what they revealed about the capacity for evil that exists within human nature when it operates without moral constraints or social accountability. Each of these dynasties began with individuals who faced genuine hardships and legitimate grievances against established authority, but their responses to these challenges evolved into something that transcended simple criminality and approached pure malevolence. Most disturbing of all was how these families demonstrated that evil could become institutionalized, passed down through generations like a family trade, refined and perfected until it became something approaching an art form. Children born into these dynasties knew no other way of life, raised from infancy to view ordinary human beings as resources to be exploited rather than fellow creatures, deserving of basic dignity and respect. The psychological profiles developed by federal investigators revealed patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about criminal behavior. Unlike individual criminals who acted on impulse or immediate need, these family dynasties planned their activities across decades, sometimes across entire lifetimes. They understood that true power came not from momentary violence, but from creating systems of control that could persist long after their original architects had died. Their recruitment methods showed sophisticated understanding of human psychology that wouldn't be formally recognized by academic researchers until decades later. They identified individuals at moments of maximum vulnerability, recent immigrants, economic refugees, people fleeing personal tragedies, and provided exactly the combination of security and purpose that these desperate souls needed most. Once drawn into the family structure, recruits found themselves gradually transformed into willing participants in activities they would have found horrifying under normal circumstances. The geographic isolation that protected these families also allowed them to develop their own cultures, complete with unique languages, customs, and belief systems that justified their criminal activities as natural and inevitable. Children raised within these isolated communities genuinely believed that the outside world was populated by enemies who would destroy their families if given the opportunity, making resistance to family authority seem not just disloyal, but suicidal. Federal investigators who interviewed survivors from these communities decades later found that many still struggled to adapt to normal social relationships. They had been raised in environments where trust was impossible, where every interaction was potentially lethal, where survival depended on constant vigilance and absolute loyalty to family authority. The psychological damage inflicted by these upbringings often proved irreversible, creating individuals who could never fully integrate into civilized society. The economic impact of these families extended far beyond their immediate criminal activities. Entire regions became economically depressed as legitimate businesses fled areas under family control, creating cycles of poverty that persisted long after the criminal dynasties themselves had been eliminated. The reputation for lawlessness that these families created around their territories discouraged investment, tourism, and development for generations, leaving some mountain communities permanently isolated from the prosperity that characterized other parts of the country. Their influence on American law enforcement was equally profound. The specialized techniques developed to combat these mountain dynasties influenced everything from FBI training programs to military special operations doctrine. The psychological warfare methods pioneered by families like the Cranes forced federal authorities to develop new approaches to criminal investigation that incorporated insights from psychiatry, anthropology, and military intelligence. The legal precedents established during prosecutions of family members created new categories of criminal conspiracy that recognized the unique challenges posed by multi-generational criminal organizations. Courts had to develop new procedures for dealing with defendants who had been raised from childhood to view criminal activity as normal and legitimate, leading to innovations in criminal psychology and rehabilitation theory that influenced the entire justice system. Perhaps most significantly, these families forced American society to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of federal authority in remote regions where geographic isolation created opportunities for alternative power structures to develop. The mountain dynasties thrived precisely because they operated in areas where conventional law enforcement was ineffective, revealing gaps in governmental coverage that persisted well into the 20th century. Their legacy continues to influence how federal authorities approach criminal organizations that operate in isolated or difficult terrain. The lessons learned from decades of struggle against mountain dynasties informed strategies for dealing with modern criminal enterprises that use geographic isolation, psychological manipulation, and multi-generational planning to avoid conventional law enforcement. The stories of these 11 families also revealed the extent to which criminal organizations could develop their own internal logic and moral systems that made their activities seem reasonable and justified to those within the organization while appearing utterly incomprehensible to outside observers. This insight proved crucial for understanding how apparently normal individuals could participate in systematic criminal activities without experiencing the guilt or moral conflict that outside observers might expect. Modern criminal profilers studying these historical cases have identified patterns of behavior and organizational development that help predict how contemporary criminal organizations might evolve under similar conditions of isolation and limited law enforcement pressure. The psychological techniques developed by families like the Cranes have been recognized as early examples of methods that would later be formally studied as brainwashing, mind control, and systematic psychological manipulation. The territorial control exercised by these families also provided early examples of how criminal organizations could essentially create their own governments in areas where legitimate authority was weak or absent. Their systems of taxation, justice, and social control demonstrated that criminal enterprises could evolve into something resembling primitive states if given sufficient time and freedom from external interference. The religious and quasi-spiritual elements that several of these families incorporated into their operations revealed how criminal organizations could exploit human needs for meaning and purpose to create loyalty that transcended simple fear or financial incentive. Families like the Ravenscrofts and the Cranes understood that people would endure almost any hardship and commit almost any crime if they believed they were serving a higher purpose or fulfilling their destiny. Their use of symbolism, ritual, and mythology showed sophisticated understanding of how human psychology responds to ceremonial and spiritual elements, even when those elements are being manipulated for purely criminal purposes. The elaborate initiation ceremonies, secret languages, and mystical belief systems developed by these families created bonds between members that proved remarkably difficult for law enforcement to break, even after the organizations themselves had been destroyed. The technological innovations developed by some of these families also demonstrated remarkable creativity and engineering skill applied to criminal purposes. The Ashford's Underground Railroad System, the Thorns Mountain Modification Projects, and the Mullins Vertical Fortress Engineering showed that criminal organizations could develop sophisticated technical capabilities when motivated by the need to maintain security and operational effectiveness. These innovations often represented genuine advances in engineering and construction techniques that were later adopted for legitimate purposes by mining companies, military engineers, and civilian construction projects. The irony that some of America's most dangerous criminals contributed to technological progress through their illegal activities was not lost on federal investigators who studied their methods. The intelligence networks developed by these families also provided early examples of systematic information gathering and analysis that anticipated developments in modern intelligence operations by decades. Their use of informants, coded communications, and strategic deception showed understanding of intelligence principles that wouldn't be formally codified by military and civilian agencies until much later. The counterintelligence techniques they developed to protect themselves from law enforcement investigation demonstrated equal sophistication, including methods for identifying undercover agents, protecting operational security, and conducting surveillance of their pursuers that rivaled anything developed by legitimate intelligence agencies of the same period. Their financial operations also showed remarkable sophistication for organizations operating in supposedly primitive mountain regions. The money laundering techniques developed by families like the Grimms and the Corbetts involved complex networks of legitimate businesses, corrupt officials, and international connections that allowed them to convert criminal profits into apparently legal wealth with efficiency that impressed even experienced federal investigators. Though international connections maintained by several of these families revealed that their operations extended far beyond the mountain regions where they based their headquarters, they maintained relationships with criminal organizations in major cities, corrupt officials in state and federal governments, and even international contacts that allowed them to move people and goods across national borders with remarkable ease. These connections also provided them with access to weapons, equipment, and expertise that wouldn't normally be available to criminals operating in isolated rural areas. The military-grade weapons found in family compounds, the sophisticated communication equipment they employed, and the professional training evident in their operations all suggested access to resources that extended far beyond what local criminal activity could have provided. The cultural impact of these families extended beyond their immediate criminal activities to influence regional folklore, literature, and popular culture in ways that persist to this day. The stories told about their exploits, whether accurate or exaggerated, became part of the cultural heritage of Appalachian communities, influencing how people in these regions viewed authority, justice, and the relationship between individual families and larger social institutions. The romanticization of some of these families in local folklore created complex attitudes toward law enforcement that complicated federal efforts to investigate and prosecute their activities. Communities that had been terrorized by criminal dynasties sometimes developed a grudging respect for their organizational abilities and resistance to outside authority, making it difficult for federal agents to gather reliable testimony or cooperation from local residents. This cultural legacy also influenced how later generations of mountain residents viewed their relationship with federal authority, contributing to persistent tensions between local communities and outside law enforcement that characterized Appalachian regions well into the modern era. The memory of these families and their conflicts with federal authorities became part of a broader narrative about mountain independence and resistance to external control that shaped regional identity for generations. The academic study of these families has provided insights into how criminal organizations develop and evolve under conditions of geographic isolation and limited law enforcement pressure. Criminologists studying their methods have identified patterns of organizational development that help predict how modern criminal enterprises might evolve under similar conditions. Anthropologists examining their cultural practices have found evidence of how isolated communities can develop alternative social structures that operate according to different moral and legal principles than those accepted by mainstream society. The family-based organization of these criminal dynasties represented a form of social organization that combined elements of clan-based societies with criminal enterprises in ways that created remarkably stable and persistent organizations. Psychologists studying the individual and group dynamics within these families have identified patterns of psychological manipulation, social control, and identity formation that provide insights into how extremist organizations of all types recruit and maintain loyalty among their members. The techniques developed by these mountain dynasties for creating unquestioning loyalty and suppressing individual moral judgment have been recognized as early examples of methods later used by various forms of totalitarian organizations. The historical significance of these 11 families extends beyond their individual crimes to encompass their role in demonstrating the challenges faced by expanding federal authority in a nation where geographic isolation could still provide sanctuary for those willing to reject civilized society entirely. Their collective story represents a chapter in American history when the federal government was still developing the capabilities necessary to enforce law and order in the most remote and difficult regions of the country. Their eventual defeat required innovations in law enforcement technique, federal coordination, and specialized training that helped transform American law enforcement from a collection of local and regional agencies into a truly national system capable of dealing with criminal organizations that operated across state boundaries and in difficult terrain. The legacy of their resistance also influenced the development of federal policies regarding law enforcement in rural and remote areas, leading to the establishment of specialized units and training programs designed to deal with criminal organizations that exploited geographic isolation and local cultural resistance to federal authority. Today, more than 8 decades after the last of these families was finally eliminated, their influence can still be detected in the methods used by federal law enforcement agencies to deal with criminal organizations that operate in isolated areas or exploit local cultural tensions to resist federal authority. The lessons learned from decades of struggle against these mountain dynasties continue to inform strategies for dealing with modern criminal enterprises that use similar techniques of geographic isolation, psychological manipulation, and cultural resistance to avoid conventional law enforcement. The mountain regions where these families once held sway remain marked by their legacy, with local communities still bearing the psychological and economic scars of their reign of terror. Some areas never fully recovered from the economic disruption caused by decades of criminal control, while others developed cultural attitudes toward authority and law enforcement that reflected their historical experience with both criminal exploitation and federal intervention. But perhaps the most important lesson these families taught was about the capacity for evil that exists within human nature when moral constraints are removed and organizational skills are applied to criminal purposes. They demonstrated that criminal enterprises could evolve into something approaching primitive governments if given sufficient time and freedom from external interference, creating their own laws, customs, and belief systems that justified activities that civilized society would find utterly incomprehensible. Their story serves as a reminder that the rule of law and the protection of individual rights depend not on abstract principles, but on the constant vigilance and active enforcement of civilized society. In the absence of effective governmental authority, these families showed how quickly human communities could devolve into something that barely deserved to be called human at all. The 11 deadliest Appalachian families represented more than just criminal organizations. They were laboratories of human evil that demonstrated the terrible creativity that emerges when intelligence, organization, and complete moral flexibility combine in individuals who recognize no authority beyond their own will to power. Their legacy stands as both a historical curiosity and a warning about what can happen when civilization's restraints are removed and humanity's darkest impulses are allowed to flourish unchecked in the shadows of America's forgotten mountains. The documentation recovered from these family compounds revealed something that federal investigators found almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves. These weren't random acts of violence committed by desperate people, but carefully planned operations executed by individuals who had transformed brutality into a science. Each family had developed their own methodologies, their own training programs, and their own twisted philosophies that justified activities no civilized person could comprehend. What emerges from studying these 11 dynasties is a pattern that challenges our fundamental understanding of how criminal organizations develop and maintain power across generations. These weren't simply gangs or even traditional organized crime families. They were something entirely different, something that existed in the spaces between civilization and wilderness, where normal rules simply didn't apply. The psychological profiles developed by federal agents revealed individuals who had been shaped by their environment in ways that made them fundamentally incompatible with civilized society. Growing up in isolated mountain communities where violence was normalized and federal authority was viewed as an external threat, these family members developed worldviews that made their criminal activities seem not just acceptable, but necessary for survival. Their recruitment techniques showed an understanding of human psychology that was decades ahead of its time. They identified vulnerable individuals, recent immigrants, economic refugees, people fleeing personal tragedies, and provided exactly what these desperate souls needed most: security, purpose, and belonging. Once drawn into the family structure, recruits found themselves gradually transformed through a combination of indoctrination, isolation, and incremental involvement in increasingly serious criminal activities. The process was so gradual that many victims didn't realize what was happening until it was too late to escape. They would begin with small favors, minor violations of law that seemed harmless in context. Gradually, their involvement would deepen until they found themselves complicit in activities that would have horrified them under normal circumstances. By the time they understood the full scope of what they had become involved in, they were too deeply implicated to seek help from outside authorities. The family structures themselves represented a perversion of traditional mountain clan systems, taking the natural loyalty and interdependence that characterized legitimate mountain communities and twisting them into something that served purely criminal purposes. Children born into these families knew no other way of life, raised from infancy to view ordinary human beings as resources to be exploited rather than fellow creatures, deserving of basic dignity and respect. The educational systems within these communities were designed to produce individuals perfectly adapted to criminal life while remaining completely alien to normal social interaction. Children learned to read by studying wanted posters and law enforcement bulletins. They learned mathematics by calculating shares of stolen goods and planning criminal operations. They learned geography by memorizing escape routes and hiding places throughout the mountain regions. Most disturbing was how these families managed to maintain their operations across multiple generations while adapting to changing law enforcement techniques and social conditions. Each generation refined the methods developed by their predecessors, learning from their mistakes while developing new approaches to criminal enterprise that stayed ahead of evolving federal capabilities. The leadership succession systems within these families ensured continuity, even when individual leaders were captured or killed. Potential successors were identified early and given specialized training that prepared them to assume command responsibilities if necessary. This redundancy made it extremely difficult for law enforcement to disrupt family operations by targeting specific individuals. The communication networks these families developed were equally sophisticated, using coded messages, trusted couriers, and even primitive radio systems to coordinate activities across vast territories. They maintained detailed intelligence files on law enforcement personnel, potential victims, and rival criminal organizations that allowed them to anticipate threats and identify opportunities with remarkable accuracy. Their financial operations involved complex networks of legitimate businesses that served as fronts for money laundering while providing cover for criminal activities. These enterprises often became genuinely profitable, creating additional revenue streams that reduced the family's dependence on obviously illegal activities while making their operations more difficult for authorities to investigate. The technological innovations developed by some families demonstrated remarkable engineering creativity applied to criminal purposes. Hidden passages, elaborate alarm systems, and sophisticated weapons modifications showed that criminal organizations could develop significant technical capabilities when motivated by the need to maintain security and operational effectiveness. Their territorial control methods combined traditional military tactics with psychological warfare techniques that anticipated developments in modern insurgency operations by decades. They understood that controlling territory wasn't just about physical presence, but about creating psychological conditions that made resistance seem impossible to local populations. The religious and quasi-spiritual elements incorporated by several families revealed sophisticated understanding of how human psychology responds to ceremonial and mystical elements, even when those elements are being manipulated for purely criminal purposes. Elaborate initiation ceremonies, secret languages, and mystical belief systems created bonds between members that proved remarkably difficult for law enforcement to break. The international connections maintained by some families showed that their operations extended far beyond the mountain regions where they maintained their headquarters. They had relationships with criminal organizations in major cities, corrupt officials in various levels of government, and even international contacts that allowed them to move people and goods across national borders with surprising ease. These connections provided access to weapons, equipment, and expertise that wouldn't normally be available to criminals operating in isolated rural areas. Military-grade weapons, sophisticated communication equipment, and professional training evident in their operations suggested access to resources that extended far beyond what local criminal activity could have provided. The counterintelligence techniques they developed to protect themselves from law enforcement investigation demonstrated equal sophistication, including methods for identifying undercover agents, protecting operational security, and conducting surveillance of their pursuers that rivaled anything developed by legitimate intelligence agencies of the same period. Their influence on federal law enforcement was profound and lasting. The specialized techniques developed to combat these mountain dynasties influenced everything from FBI training programs to military special operations doctrine. The psychological warfare methods pioneered by families like the Cranes forced federal authorities to develop entirely new approaches to criminal investigation that incorporated insights from psychiatry, anthropology, and military intelligence. The legal precedents established during prosecutions of family members created new categories of criminal conspiracy that recognized the unique challenges posed by multi-generational criminal organizations. Courts had to develop new procedures for dealing with defendants who had been raised from childhood to view criminal activity as normal and legitimate, leading to innovations in criminal psychology and rehabilitation theory. The economic impact of these families extended far beyond their immediate criminal activities. Entire regions became economically depressed as legitimate businesses fled areas under family control, creating cycles of poverty that persisted long after the criminal dynasties themselves had been eliminated. Some mountain communities never fully recovered from the economic disruption caused by decades of criminal control. The cultural legacy of these families influenced regional folklore, literature, and popular culture in ways that persist to this day. Stories about their exploits, whether accurate or exaggerated, became part of the cultural heritage of Appalachian communities, influencing how people in these regions viewed authority, justice, and the relationship between individual families and larger social institutions. The romanticization of some families in local folklore created complex attitudes toward law enforcement that complicated federal efforts to investigate and prosecute their activities. Communities that had been terrorized by criminal dynasties sometimes developed grudging respect for their organizational abilities and resistance to outside authority, making it difficult for federal agents to gather reliable testimony or cooperation from local residents. Academic study of these families has provided insights into how criminal organizations develop and evolve under conditions of geographic isolation and limited law enforcement pressure. Criminologists studying their methods have identified patterns of organizational development that help predict how modern criminal enterprises might evolve under similar conditions. Anthropologists examining their cultural practices have found evidence of how isolated communities can develop alternative social structures that operate according to different moral and legal principles than those accepted by mainstream society. The family-based organization of these criminal dynasties represented a form of social organization that combined elements of clan-based societies with criminal enterprises in ways that created remarkably stable and persistent organizations. Psychologists studying the individual and group dynamics within these families have identified patterns of psychological manipulation, social control, and identity formation that provide insights into how extremist organizations of all types recruit and maintain loyalty among their members. The techniques developed by these mountain dynasties for creating unquestioning loyalty and suppressing individual moral judgment have been recognized as early examples of methods later used by various forms of totalitarian organizations. The historical significance of these 11 families extends beyond their individual crimes to encompass their role in demonstrating the challenges faced by expanding federal authority in a nation where geographic isolation could still provide sanctuary for those willing to reject civilized society entirely. Their collective story represents a chapter in American history when the federal government was still developing the capabilities necessary to enforce law and order in the most remote and difficult regions of the country. Their eventual defeat required innovations in law enforcement technique, federal coordination, and specialized training that helped transform American law enforcement from a collection of local and regional agencies into a truly national system capable of dealing with criminal organizations that operated across state boundaries and in difficult terrain. The mountain regions where these families once held sway remain marked by their legacy, with local communities still bearing the psychological and economic scars of their reign of terror. Certain valleys remain sparsely populated, certain trails are still avoided by experienced hikers, and certain peaks are still associated with stories that parents use to keep children from wandering too far into the wilderness. Federal law enforcement agencies continue to apply lessons learned from their struggles against these mountain dynasties when dealing with modern criminal organizations that exploit geographic isolation, psychological manipulation, and cultural resistance to avoid conventional law enforcement. The specialized training programs, investigative techniques, and coordination procedures developed during these campaigns continue to influence how authorities approach similar challenges today. But perhaps the most important lesson these families taught was about the capacity for organized evil that can emerge when moral constraints are removed and criminal enterprises are allowed to evolve without effective opposition. They demonstrated that in the absence of civilized authority, human communities could develop their own twisted systems of law and order that served purely predatory purposes while maintaining internal logic that made sense to those raised within such systems. Their story serves as a reminder that the rule of law and protection of individual rights depend not on abstract principles, but on the constant vigilance and active enforcement of civilized society. These 11 families showed what could happen when that vigilance failed and criminal organizations were allowed to establish their own alternative governments in America's forgotten corners. The documentation and evidence recovered from their compounds revealed criminal enterprises that had evolved into something approaching primitive states, complete with their own taxation systems, courts of justice, and military organizations. They had created their own currencies, developed their own languages, and established their own educational systems designed to produce new generations of criminals perfectly adapted to their twisted version of mountain life. Most chilling was the discovery that several families had been planning to expand their influence beyond their mountain strongholds, with evidence suggesting attempts to establish criminal colonies in other isolated regions, and even to influence legitimate political processes in areas where their economic power could be converted into actual governmental authority. The final raids that eliminated these families required military-style operations involving thousands of federal agents, specialized equipment, and coordination between multiple agencies that had never previously worked together on such a scale. The battles that followed were unlike anything in American law enforcement history, with combat occurring in terrain and conditions that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. When the compounds finally fell and the surviving family members were captured, investigators found evidence of crimes spanning multiple decades and involving thousands of victims whose fates had never been officially recorded. The scope of their activities challenged fundamental assumptions about the effectiveness of American law enforcement and revealed gaps in federal authority that persisted well into the 20th century. Today, more than 8 decades after the last of these criminal dynasties was finally eliminated, their influence can still be detected in the methods used by federal agencies to deal with organized crime, domestic terrorism, and other forms of criminal enterprise that exploit geographic isolation and cultural resistance to federal authority. The lessons learned from decades of struggle against these mountain families continue to inform modern law enforcement strategies and training programs. The 11 deadliest Appalachian families represented something unique in American criminal history. Not just individual criminals or even traditional organized crime families, but something that approached alternative civilizations built on foundations of systematic exploitation and violence. They showed how criminal enterprises could evolve into complex social organizations when given sufficient time and freedom from external interference, creating their own cultures, beliefs, and institutions that served purely predatory purposes. Their legacy stands as both historical curiosity and cautionary tale about what can emerge when civilization's restraints are removed and humanity's darkest impulses are allowed to flourish unchecked. In the end, they were defeated not by superior firepower or investigative technique, but by the gradual expansion of federal authority into regions that had previously existed beyond the reach of civilized law. But their defeat came at an enormous cost, requiring resources and sacrifices that revealed just how dangerous criminal organizations could become when allowed to establish themselves in isolated territories where conventional law enforcement was ineffective. The mountain regions they once controlled still bear scars from their activities, and the communities that survived their reign of terror required generations to recover from the psychological and economic damage they inflicted. The story of these 11 families serves as a reminder that the expansion of civilization into America's most remote regions was not just a matter of building roads and establishing towns, but of extending the rule of law into territories where alternative forms of social organization had taken root. Their elimination marked the end of an era when geographic isolation could still provide sanctuary for those willing to reject the basic principles of civilized society. In studying their methods, their organization, and their eventual defeat, we gain insights not just into a dark chapter of American history, but into the ongoing challenges faced by any society that seeks to maintain law and order across diverse and difficult terrain. The lessons learned from confronting these mountain dynasties continue to inform how modern authorities deal with criminal organizations that exploit isolation, manipulation, and cultural resistance to avoid conventional law enforcement. Their story reminds us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance, and that even in modern America, there remain corners where darkness can take root if we fail to maintain the institutions and principles that separate civilized society from the brutal alternatives that these 11 families represented so completely. The psychological profiles developed by federal investigators revealed patterns that challenged every assumption about criminal behavior and family dynamics. These weren't individuals driven by desperation or momentary lapses in judgment. They were architects of systematic evil who had transformed brutality into a hereditary craft passed down through bloodlines like a family trade. What made these dynasties truly terrifying wasn't just their capacity for violence, but their multi-generational commitment to perfecting it. Each successive generation refined the methods developed by their predecessors, learning from their mistakes while developing new approaches that stayed ahead of evolving federal capabilities. Children born into these families underwent what can only be described as systematic conditioning, designed to strip away normal human empathy while maximizing their effectiveness as predators. The recruitment techniques employed by these families showed understanding of human psychology that was decades ahead of its time. They identified vulnerable individuals at moments of maximum desperation, recent immigrants with no local connections, economic refugees fleeing failed farms, people escaping personal tragedies, and provided exactly what these desperate souls needed most: security, purpose, belonging, and most importantly, a sense that their suffering finally meant something. The process was so gradual that many victims never realized what was happening until escape became impossible. It began with small favors, minor violations that seemed harmless in context. A request to carry a message, store some items, look the other way during a suspicious transaction. Gradually, their involvement deepened through carefully orchestrated steps that made each subsequent request seem like a natural progression from what they'd already accepted. By the time recruits understood the full scope of what they'd become involved in, they were too deeply implicated to seek help from outside authorities. They had participated in activities that made them criminals in the eyes of the law, while their detailed knowledge of family operations made them targets for elimination if they attempted to leave. The psychological bonds created through this process proved remarkably difficult to break, even after the families themselves had been destroyed. The educational systems within these criminal communities represented perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their operations. Children learned to read using wanted posters and law enforcement bulletins. They studied mathematics by calculating shares of stolen goods and planning criminal logistics. Geography lessons focused on memorizing escape routes, hiding places, and territorial boundaries throughout the mountain regions. Most chilling was how these families managed to maintain operational security across multiple generations while adapting to changing law enforcement techniques and social conditions. They developed succession planning that ensured continuity even when key leaders were captured or killed. Potential successors underwent specialized training that prepared them to assume command responsibilities at a moment's notice, creating redundancy that made family operations extremely resilient to external pressure. Their intelligence networks rivaled anything developed by legitimate government agencies of the same period. They maintained detailed files on law enforcement personnel, tracking career movements, family relationships, and personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited. They knew which judges could be bribed, which sheriffs could be intimidated, and which federal agents were incorruptible and therefore required elimination. The communication systems these families developed allowed coordination across vast territories using methods that seemed almost supernatural to outside observers. Coded messages hidden in seemingly innocent correspondence, trusted couriers who could traverse difficult terrain without detection, and even primitive radio networks that allowed real-time coordination of complex operations spanning multiple states. Their financial operations involved sophisticated money laundering through networks of legitimate businesses that often became genuinely profitable enterprises. General stores, lumber mills, mining operations, and even small banks served as fronts while providing additional revenue streams that reduced dependence on obviously illegal activities. These legitimate enterprises also provided cover for gathering intelligence about potential victims and law enforcement activities. The technological innovations developed by some families, demonstrated remarkable engineering creativity applied to criminal purposes. Hidden passages that allowed movement through seemingly solid walls, elaborate alarm systems that could detect intruders miles away, and weapons modifications that increased lethality while reducing noise and muzzle flash. Their strongholds incorporated defensive features that wouldn't have seemed out of place in medieval fortresses, adapted for modern weapons and mountain terrain. What set these families apart from ordinary criminals was their understanding that true power came from controlling what people believed about reality itself. They cultivated reputations for supernatural abilities by demonstrating knowledge that seemed impossible for mortal beings to possess. Family members would approach strangers and casually mention personal details about their lives, family histories, and secret fears that no outsider could have known through conventional means. This apparent omniscience created psychological dominance that made resistance seem futile. Victims found themselves believing that the families possessed powers beyond human understanding, that opposition would inevitably fail, and that survival depended on cooperation rather than resistance. The psychological warfare techniques they employed anticipated developments in modern intelligence operations by decades. Their territorial control methods combined traditional military tactics with psychological manipulation that created conditions where local populations policed themselves rather than risk family displeasure. Communities under family influence developed their own informal systems of surveillance and reporting that made formal law enforcement redundant. Neighbors watched neighbors, children reported on parents, and everyone understood that certain topics were simply not discussed. The religious and quasi-spiritual elements incorporated by several families revealed sophisticated understanding of how human psychology responds to ceremonial and mystical elements, even when those elements serve purely manipulative purposes. Elaborate initiation ceremonies created bonds between members that transcended simple criminal association, while secret languages and mystical belief systems made membership feel like participation in something greater than ordinary criminal enterprise. Federal investigators who studied these operations found that many family members genuinely believed they were serving purposes that transcended normal human morality. They had been convinced that their activities were necessary for survival, justified by higher principles, or mandated by forces beyond human understanding. This genuine conviction made them far more dangerous than criminals motivated solely by greed or desperation. The international connections maintained by some families showed that their operations extended far beyond the mountain regions where they maintained their headquarters. They had relationships with criminal organizations in major cities, corrupt officials at various levels of government, and even international contacts that allowed them to move people and goods across national borders with surprising ease. These connections provided access to weapons, equipment, and expertise that wouldn't normally be available to criminals operating in isolated rural areas. Military-grade weapons found in family compounds, sophisticated communication equipment, and evidence of professional training suggested access to resources that extended far beyond what local criminal activity could have provided. The counterintelligence techniques they developed to protect themselves from law enforcement investigation demonstrated equal sophistication. Methods for identifying undercover agents, protecting operational security, and conducting surveillance of their pursuers rivaled anything developed by legitimate intelligence agencies. They could often predict federal operations with uncanny accuracy, allowing them to avoid major raids while continuing to expand their criminal enterprises. Their influence on American law enforcement was profound and lasting. The specialized techniques developed to combat these mountain dynasties influenced everything from FBI training programs to military special operations doctrine. Federal authorities were forced to develop entirely new approaches to criminal investigation that incorporated insights from psychiatry, anthropology, and military intelligence. The legal precedents established during prosecutions of family members created new categories of criminal conspiracy that recognized the unique challenges posed by multi-generational criminal organizations. Courts had to develop new procedures for dealing with defendants who had been raised from childhood to view criminal activity as normal and legitimate, leading to innovations in criminal psychology and rehabilitation theory. Today, more than 8 decades after the last of these families was finally eliminated, their methods continue to influence how federal agencies approach criminal organizations that exploit geographic isolation, psychological manipulation, and cultural resistance to avoid conventional law enforcement. The lessons learned from decades of struggle against these mountain dynasties remain relevant as authorities deal with modern criminal enterprises that use similar techniques. The documentation recovered from family compounds revealed criminal organizations that had evolved into something approaching alternative governments, complete with their own taxation systems, courts of justice, and military hierarchies. They had created their own currencies, developed their own languages, and established educational systems designed to produce new generations perfectly adapted to their version of mountain life. The final campaigns that eliminated these families required military-style operations involving thousands of federal agents, specialized equipment, and coordination between agencies that had never previously worked together on such a scale. The battles that followed were unlike anything in American law enforcement history, with combat occurring in terrain and conditions that pushed human endurance to absolute limits. When investigators finally penetrated these strongholds, they discovered evidence of crimes spanning multiple decades, involving thousands of victims whose fates had never been officially recorded. The scope of their activities revealed gaps in federal authority that persisted well into the 20th century, challenging fundamental assumptions about the effectiveness of American law enforcement in remote regions. The 11 deadliest Appalachian families represented something unique in criminal history, not just individual outlaws or traditional organized crime, but alternative civilizations built on foundations of systematic exploitation and violence. They demonstrated how criminal enterprises could evolve into complex social organizations when given sufficient time and freedom from external interference. Their legacy serves as both historical curiosity and cautionary tale about what emerges when civilization's restraints are removed and humanity's darkest impulses flourish unchecked. They were ultimately defeated not by superior firepower or investigative technique, but by the gradual expansion of federal authority into regions that had previously existed beyond the reach of civilized law. But their defeat came at enormous cost, requiring resources and sacrifices that revealed just how dangerous criminal organizations could become when allowed to establish themselves in territories where conventional law enforcement was ineffective. The mountain regions they once controlled still bear scars from their activities, and communities that survived their reign required generations to recover from the psychological and economic damage inflicted. In the end, these families showed us something fundamental about human nature and the price of civilization. They revealed that in the absence of effective governmental authority, even in 20th century America, alternative forms of social organization could take root that served purely predatory purposes while maintaining internal logic that made sense to those raised within such systems. Their story reminds us that the rule of law depends not on abstract principles, but on constant vigilance and active enforcement by civilized society. The expansion of federal authority into America's most remote regions wasn't just about building infrastructure and establishing towns. It was about extending the fundamental protections of civilized law into territories where brutal alternatives had taken root. The 11 deadliest Appalachian families marked the end of an era when geographic isolation could still provide sanctuary for those willing to reject the basic principles of human decency. Their elimination represented a crucial victory in the ongoing struggle to ensure that no corner of America remained beyond the reach of justice, no matter how remote or seemingly impenetrable. Today, as we face new challenges from criminal organizations that exploit technology, international borders, and cultural divisions to avoid conventional law enforcement, the lessons learned from confronting these mountain dynasties remain as relevant as ever. They remind us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance, and that even in modern America, darkness can take root wherever we fail to maintain the institutions and principles that separate civilized society from the brutal alternatives these 11 families represented so completely. So the next time you find yourself driving through the remote mountain regions of Appalachia, remember that you're traveling through territories that were once kingdoms of terror, ruled by families whose names were spoken only in whispers and whose influence extended far beyond anything you'll find recorded in official histories. The mountains remember what civilized society would prefer to forget, and in the mist-shrouded hollows where these dynasties once held sway, some say you can still feel the lingering presence of America's darkest chapter. If this deep dive into America's hidden criminal history left you looking over your shoulder, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We've got more buried secrets waiting to be uncovered, more forgotten chapters of history that will challenge everything you thought you knew about law and order in this country. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous monsters in American history weren't the ones hiding in the woods. They were the ones who built their kingdoms there